back to our discussion on the novel Wuthering Heights. So far we have discussed the topics of women's fiction in the 19th century and Emily Bronte, a biographical sketch. Today we shall discuss the text itself of Wuthering Heights. To begin, we shall look at the text and the historical context of the novel. Wuthering Heights was published in 1847, but it was set in 1801. That is, the novel begins with 1801 when Mr. Lockwood starts journaling about his trip to his landlord's house. This is when he comes to occupy Thrushcross Grange as the new tenant. However, the novel takes us further back in time, to the 1770s, when Heathcliff was first brought into the family by Mr. Earnshaw, the father, from his journey to Liverpool. We get to know that Heathcliff, an orphan perhaps, who was found on the road and is often referred to as a kind of a gypsy. Thus, the range of the novel is vast, right? Its timeline is complex, right, which might also appear difficult to keep track of. The novel written, and we have to remember these timelines because Emily Bronte is writing it around 1845. By 47 it is published, but then it is set in 1801 when Lockwood begins to write about it. And then the period before that, that is the past life of Heathcliff, when he is first brought into the family. Of course, you would also notice, and therefore you sometimes might have a problem as to who is the protagonist of this novel. Is it Heathcliff? But isn't Heathcliff an anti-hero in many ways? Yet you would find that Emily Bronte could get under the skin of this character, a man, and speak from his point of view. Could it also be the reason that she was writing under a male pseudonym of Ellis Bell and so found it convenient to take the man as the protagonist of her novel? Or was it that being a woman at that time had many limitations in the 19th century, and by using the character of Heathcliff as a kind of a protagonist, Emily Bronte was able to give freedom to her imagination and her wild side? So all these questions need to be taken up, right? Because we are charting the history of Heathcliff, and the novel keeps going back and forth in time, where you have Heathcliff in the present time in 1801 when Lockwood, the narrator, meets him, and there is the Heathcliff of the 1770s. He was a very young boy who was first brought into the Earnshaw family by the father. Right. So, and his parentage is an issue. He is often referred to as a gypsy. What was his parentage like? Now, these are some of the questions that remain unanswered. No, but even Nellie Dean, who was otherwise the narrator of this entire episode within Lockwood's narrative, even she is unable to answer for this. She doesn't know the beginnings of Heathcliff. So, there are certain dead ends in the novel which remain unanswered, certain questions that remain unanswered, and the narrator and the author likes to keep it that way. And yet it is important for us to keep a track of the different timelines that are available in the novel. The period when Emily Bronte wrote it, because she would be talking about her formative years, her life that she has seen. She was born in 1818, right? So she obviously wasn't there at 1801, but she's imagining a life before she was born. So her own present time and her own conditions seem to be at the background or seem to be at the backdrop of this novel. But obviously the text itself, if we are speaking of Wuthering Heights, we find that it is the period of 1800 that it is trying to evoke, the period before it and the years that follow. Now, historically this period is also quite volatile. There has already been a French Revolution by 1789. We are taken to the 1770s in the narrative of Nellie, who tells us that Heathcliff was brought into the house when he was a young boy and made to live with the family as a brother of the siblings. So all these are important, but also historical developments and the historical moments in history, these are equally important, and you will find that they have a bearing on the novel as such. The range of the novel thus is vast and its timeline is complex. Specifically, the novel actually evokes the life of a secluded family that is living away from society, surrounded by the moorlands on all sides and with neighbors who lived miles apart. It is not a city situation, it's a countryside, right? And in the countryside, they don't have neighbors right around them. They're on one moorland, and the Wuthering Heights is on the other. So there is not this kind of daily interaction with the outside world. The family lived as a kind of a secluded family in themselves. Of course, Emily Bronte too grew up in such surroundings with wild grasslands all over that was spread across the region. So she was quite close to nature in that sense. The vast expanse of nature seen in its myriad forms added to a kind of intensity of feeling in the writer. She became more sensitive, her feelings became more intense, and therefore you find in Wuthering Heights that whatever emotion is projected through Catherine or Heathcliff, whether it is of violence, revenge or love, all these are very intense feelings. The characters actually feel it, and with their whole body and soul, as it were. So which she is able to. So Emily Bronte is actually able to express this side of her own self in the novel. Otherwise she was seen as this shy, fragile, or this kind of a feeble sort of a girl. But then she had this kind of intensity of feeling and this kind of courage that she tried to bring to her novel. Of course, this is the only novel she wrote. For instance, when Lockwood speaks about the people in the countryside, he speaks as an outsider who has lived in cities. He claims the people in this region, and I quote, live more in earnest, more in themselves, and less in surface, change, and frivolous external things. I could fancy a love for life here almost possible. End quote. So you can already see that Lockwood is fascinated by these characters because of this depth of feeling that they harbor, because of the sense of earnest kind of emotion that they feel, and they live life in earnest and not on the surface, not with many frivolous sort of external things that leave an impact on them, but they have a kind of an internal life, and that is what also distinguishes this family from everybody else, that they seem to be, particularly the characters of Catherine and Heathcliff, they seem to be living a kind of an internal life, a more rich internal life, and not a frivolous sort of a external life that that Lockwood here mentions. And this is what draws him into the vortex of this family drama, so to speak. And he also mentions that he could fancy a love for life here almost possible, something that he had given up. Remember, in the very beginning we are told that in fact Lockwood tells us that he's turned into a kind of a misanthrope, and therefore he might like the company of Heathcliff, who was a kind of a capital fellow according to him. So from that point to becoming a person who thinks that I could fancy love for life here almost possible means that he's intensely fascinated by the characters who live in Wuthering Heights, and he's very much interested in their history. There is again why he's interested and fascinated is also because he finds it very mysterious, the whole living itself. First of all, he's quite amused by the idea that Heathcliff, who's quite rich, should let out Thrushcross Grange, which is a kind of a beautiful home where Lockwood is living, but should choose to live in a kind of a raw, earthy place like Wuthering Heights. And he asks Nellie Dean that why does he do that? Why has he chosen a kind of a raw, barren place as his home, and he's giving a beautiful house to tenants? Of course, there is mystery behind it that he doesn't know, and Nellie Dean is all happy to tell him about the life there. So there is mystery surrounding characters, which makes Lockwood more interested in the subject of their lives. Mystery is a very important element in this novel. He compels Nellie Dean to tell him all about the rough, insolent landlord that he has of Heathcliff, and at the same time he is equally curious to know about the life history of this young widow in the house that he meets, and he's not able to guess the true stature of this girl and the relationship that she has with others in this house. He in fact fails miserably in gauging the true nature of the relationship between Heathcliff and young Cathy. He initially thinks that young Cathy is Heathcliff's wife, although he notices the age gap between the two. Heathcliff, in Lockwood's view, looked almost 40, and the young girl was barely 17. So he makes a fool of himself when he tries to make his acquaintance, and lands up in a kind of a quandary. He doesn't know how to react to situations because he makes all wrong guesses about these people, which in fact draws him further into the lives of these characters. So chapter 1 of the novel actually introduces the character of Heathcliff to us, who often enough in the novel is characterized as a kind of a dark-skinned gypsy. For most parts, you find that Lockwood is left bewildered by this rough hardiness of Heathcliff. He cannot understand why this man is antisocial, rough, hardy, insolent at times, indifferent at others. He is unable to make assessment of this man. He attributes this to the rawness of the place itself. So, in a way, Heathcliff is an extension of Wuthering Heights. The place itself seems to make home in him. Or could we also say that Heathcliff is what Wuthering Heights is, or Wuthering Heights is in fact an extension of his own person and his own being. So there is a rawness about him in the novel, and Heathcliff doesn't want to become refined. You see, the question of class comes in right in the beginning of the novel, because you can see the moment Heathcliff is brought into the family by Mr. Earnshaw the senior, he is not seen as a sibling simply because of the class that he belongs to, because he is probably an orphan who was left on the road. And there is a kind of refinement that others around him have, but he rejects it. In fact, he doesn't want to become like them. He continues to remain this kind of a rugged fellow, or this kind of a hardiness and this kind of roughness about him. He wants to maintain that. He, of course, is shorn of all societal decorums and norms. He doesn't seem to follow them, right, of family, of home, of of other kind of societal norms that work in, of education. So Heathcliff was brought in by Mr. Earnshaw because he, of course, took pity on this boy, and then he decided to treat him as his own son, and decided to bring him up in the same manner as he would bring his own kids. Till he was alive, Heathcliff got the education that Earnshaw wanted him to have. But soon after the death of Mr. Earnshaw, you find that Heathcliff is left on his own and left to fend for himself, so much so that his education is taken away from him, and he is driven to work like a servant in the house by Hindley. Right, Mr. Earnshaw's son, who makes sure that the difference of class between them remains certain and defined. He takes away the value of education from Heathcliff and treats him as the servant in the house, makes him do all the odd work in the house. So and outside on the farm and with the stable. So you can see that class distinctions are very much maintained here in the novel itself. He attributes again, Lockwood then is meeting Heathcliff for the first time, who is at the moment when he meets Heathcliff, he's a rich fellow. So he can't understand why a rich fellow like him should remain this kind of a rough, hardy person. So hence the mystery attached with Heathcliff for Lockwood. So Lockwood is initially fascinated by the character of Heathcliff, at least till he spends the night in Wuthering Heights and sees the behavior of his landlord, who seems to be laughing at him when the dogs, for instance, attack Lockwood, and he finds them completely insensitive and devoid of any kind of humanity. The only person who comes to save him, is the housekeeper. Everybody else seems to be laughing at his predicament when he's attacked by the ferocious dogs of the house. So he's not able to make sense of this house that doesn't seem to live like a family, that has in fact bonds not of love but of hatred, of jealousy, of revenge. And this is therefore a family which is unlike a kind of a Christian family that he would otherwise imagine in his own surroundings. So there is a kind of an element of strangeness about this place around Wuthering Heights, that is, apart from this kind of mystery that is attached with it. So while these characters appear mysterious to Lockwood, they also at the same time appear strange, and so does the house, Wuthering Heights. Right. Now, Wuthering Heights, the place, has kind of an eerie quality about it, which again gets added to the mysterious element, but also abnormals. So, characters here appear to be not normal characters to Lockwood. There seems to be a kind of mystery around them, and at the same time the place seems rather strange and barren, and the character of, so whether it is the character of Heathcliff or the behavior of young Cathy towards him, who asks him whether you were called for tea, and when Lockwood says, well, I wasn't, she shuts it and keeps it off and doesn't even offer him tea. So there is the character of Heathcliff, and there is the behavior of young Cathy that bewilders him. Again, the disgruntled figure of Hareton, who he doesn't know anything about. Initially he thinks Hareton is a servant, but then Hareton doesn't have this kind of a servant-like civility, and so he thinks perhaps he is a family member, but he can't guess the situation of Hareton vis-a-vis Heathcliff and Cathy. Certainly it is of animosity that they each share with one another. So whether it is the character of Heathcliff or young Cathy, whose behavior he can't make sense of, or for that matter the disgruntled figure of Hareton, further the insolence of Joseph, who doesn't seem to attach value to guests and unwelcomes in fact Lockwood when he comes to the house, or the presence of the ferocious dogs in that ancient house called Wuthering Heights. All these actually create the atmosphere of an alien surrounding and give a sense of grotesque, the quality of the grotesque to Wuthering Heights, the place and the people. All of these intrigue Lockwood as much as bewilder him. These in fact then help create a kind of a Gothic atmosphere very early on in the novel. I mean, if you look at the novel, there are so many elements. There is mystery, there is a kind of an eerie quality, or this kind of strangeness about characters that we don't understand. Add to it, it also adds a kind of a Gothic feature in it. Now, this Gothic atmosphere, which begins from chapter 1 onwards, the kind of strangeness in characters and the place, it actually sees a kind of a culmination in chapter 3. When Lockwood encounters the ghost of Catherine, right? Now, the Gothic, if we speak of the Gothic really, the Gothic, especially in literature, is characterized by horror or a sense of mystery. Now, horror is more important in chapter 3 because till this moment Lockwood is curious because he finds the characters mysterious. But in chapter 3 he actually comes across this kind of a ghost of Catherine, which leaves him horrified. As Lockwood, and the background, let me give you a background to this episode then. As Lockwood is just the new tenant at Thrushcross Grange. As he returns to Wuthering Heights on the second day of his arrival, he is forced to stay the night at the place because of the foul weather conditions outside, and the whole terrain is covered with deep snow and he wouldn't know his way, it gets dark, so he realizes that he has no option but to stay in the house perhaps, or he actually requests Heathcliff to offer him some help in terms of a guide or a farm, a farm person who could help him find his way back to Thrushcross Grange. But he is later told that there is no one in the house except for the people residing there, and there are not peasants out there, or there are no farmers out there who are helping the land. It's only the people that he sees in the house. So nobody is ready to show him the way out, and therefore he's left with no option but to stay in the house. So the housekeeper finally stations him, after the episode when he's attacked by the dogs of Heathcliff and everybody is laughing. He wants to get out, but he cannot. He feels humiliated in this situation, but he must bear with it because he has no other option. So the housekeeper actually stations Lockwood in the room of dead Catherine, where much of drama also takes place. Catherine, who is Heathcliff's actual beloved, right? Whose loss he is not able to bear. So, the housekeeper stations Lockwood in the room of the dead Catherine, and Heathcliff doesn't know about it, but at midnight Lockwood dreams, he has several dreams on that night because he's already attacked and feeling tired and wounded. He has multiple dreams, and in one such dream he actually sees that he is going near the window to and the hand of the dead Catherine catches hold of him, appearing from the window, dashes from the window, and it takes hold of his wrist, and he pleading to be let inside the room. And obviously Lockwood sends out a sharp shriek in terror, which awakens Heathcliff, who comes to his rescue. Finally Lockwood is not able to sleep here any longer in this house, and he spends the night in utter horror and waiting for some light to show so he can leave this place, and he rushes back to his residence early morning. What this episode really shows us, the introduction of the Gothic element or the Gothic theme in the novel, that there are eerie kind of things taking place, and the strangeness is not just with the people who are living, but there is actually the ghosts of the dead that surround this. So this in a way completes the Gothic theme in the novel. Now something about the Gothic theme that you should know really is that the Gothic fiction as such became very popular in the 19th century. If you remember, if you're aware of Emily Bronte's sister's novel, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, you would know that even Charlotte Bronte made use of the Gothic element by giving us the figure of Bertha Mason in her novel, who's locked up in a kind of an attic, and there is a house where her shrieks can be heard. So there was this kind of an element of the horror, the kind of ghostly element about it that the novel had. Again, if you think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, you would know that she in fact creates a monster who's walking on this earth and who's pursuing the creator, right? So the Gothic is introduced in Wuthering Heights right in the beginning, which also again fuels the suspense of the reader. One thinks that perhaps there is going to be more ghosts around, perhaps some dead people waking up from the grave, or what. So there is a thrill element attached to the plot, right? Along with the other aspects of mystery that are there, there is also the Gothic element that creates suspense and fuels the imagination of the reader and adds the required thrill to the plot itself. Right. Now, the Gothic fiction, therefore, if we look at the Gothic as such, is the voice of, in many ways, particularly speaking from the point of view of a woman writer, and contextualizing it, if we contextualize this Gothic theme as in itself, we would find that women in the 19th century felt very repressed. Society was anything but free, right? Victorian society or the entire 19th century, in fact, repressed women because it limited women in the sphere of the domestic space and didn't give much space for them to voice their desires or their will. And so women often found that they were often able to express their repressed emotions or their subconscious sort of selves in this kind of a Gothic projection. In many ways you could find that perhaps this was the dead Catherine, the ghost of Catherine, the violent Catherine is another side of Emily Bronte. Just as Charlotte Bronte, when she created Bertha Mason, then she was also probably creating an alter ego, her side which she could not show to society because society wouldn't see violent sort of women or see aggressive women. So aggression was never attached with women, and therefore they felt, which was in fact repressed. They were supposed to be civilized people, and in therefore creating a space of the Gothic, that is the unnatural, right, the horror, that which evokes horror, they could actually also represent that side of their person or their imagination which would find no welcome space in society as such, or you could say civilized society. So at the same time, so Gothic in a way is very, you would find it taking shape in women's fiction particularly because it gave them an outlet to vent their desires, their repressed emotions, and they could create a kind of a monster if they liked, because that monster probably lived inside these writers. So you need to contextualize the very Gothic element and the theme of these novels vis-a-vis the time period and the condition of women at the time in 19th century. Along with that, another development, again contextualizing, we've spoken, we are dealing with the text and the context here. So you find that developments in science, with for instance, Darwin around the same time when this novel is written, in a couple of years, would talk about the idea of evolution, right, and not creation, debunking the idea of creation of human beings. Now, developments in science were constantly challenging ideas about society, about Christianity, about religion, about everything that people knew about life at the time and took it to be true. There was this kind of rational, there was a kind of positivism which was taking shape, which meant that scientifically and rationally evaluating everything. So, with these developments in science actually opened a kind of a new window to the impossible. Hence, Gothic, mystery, the phenomena of life itself were things that could be unraveled, to see the meaning there. So, the desire to unravel these mysteries added a kind of this added dimension to explore the sphere of the unknown, the strange, the mystery, the mystery oriented or the Gothic. So, again, you see, these writers are using the kind of this mode of the supernatural, you could say, to understand what is the knowledge that is still unavailable to human beings. What we understand automatically turns into the natural or the normal. What we don't understand is what we call monstrous, abnormal or unnatural or supernatural, right? So, because knowledge itself was being questioned in the 19th century because of these scientific developments taking place, so writers were also testing the waters and trying to find new meanings to regular things and giving space to the unnatural or the supernatural in their own works, right. So, this is something that we need to keep in mind when we are dealing with the subject of the Gothic in Wuthering Heights itself. So, we have tried to talk about, I've actually tried to open the text today for discussion in terms of the text that it is and the context that, from where it emerges. When we meet next time, we'll take up some more topics from the text and deal with them specifically. For now, that's all from my end. Thank you.